Subcommittee on National Security and the Subcommittee on Health Benefits and Administrative Rules will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. On November 20th, 2014, President Obama announced a series of executive actions regarding illegal immigration. These actions grant benefits to non-citizens who are unlawfully present in the United States, including work permits and Social Security numbers. 26 states, among others, have challenged the legality and constitutionality of these actions. In fact, a federal district court has recently issued a preliminary injunction halting implementation of these executive actions. Time will tell whether the President's actions will hold up in court. Enacting major policy changes by executive fiat deprives the American people of their right to influence important policy debates. With this in mind, the fiscal costs associated with the President's actions need to be examined, as the American people will be required to pay the tab for what the President did. Unfortunately, but not surprisingly, the Obama administration has not released any numbers on how much these executive actions will cost American taxpayers. Nor is there any evidence that the Obama administration sought advice from other government agencies or departments, let alone state and local governments, about the consequences of these actions. IRS Commissioner John Koskinen recently testified before this committee that the White House did not consult with him when putting together its immigration plan. This is noteworthy because illegal immigrants granted Social Security numbers will be able to claim the refundable Earned Income Tax Credit. They will be able to file retroactively amended returns for the prior 3 years for work performed illegally in the United States. This means that illegal immigrants benefiting from the President's action will be able to claim as much as, and perhaps more than, $24,000 in refunds, even though the work performed was not lawful to begin with. And of course, the work permits issued to illegal immigrants under the President's executive orders will give the amnestied illegal worker a hiring preference over an American worker due to being exempt from Obamacare's employer mandate. Furthermore, it is an open question if the non-citizens granted legal status will be tax consumers or tax contributors. That is, will they consume more in benefits than they pay in taxes? And to answer that question, among others, we have a panel of distinguished experts today to discuss the possible costs of the President's executive actions. The White House, federal agencies, Congress, state and local governments need to understand the cost of these actions should they go forward. The American taxpayer should not have to bear the burden of paying for an illegal program. I ask unanimous consent that our colleague and fellow Government Oversight Reform member, Mr. Gosar, be allowed to fully participate in today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize Mr. Cartwright, the ranking member of the Benefits Subcommittee, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I thank you for convening this afternoon's hearing on the potential costs of the administration's executive actions on immigration. There are indeed costs to immigration, costs that really can't be boiled down to a pithy soundbite. Certainly there's much disagreement on what to do about the 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States, but I think we can all agree that the cost of doing nothing is too much to bear. That's why I've supported and will continue to support comprehensive immigration reform that includes a tough but fair path to citizenship. I believe illegal conduct must be punished with heavy fees and fines, and that dangerous undocumented persons need to be deported. A plan like that would bring undocumented immigrants out of the shadows and transform them into tax-paying individuals, paying their fair share into our health care system and our Social Security system. Last Congress, the Senate passed a bipartisan bill that would have helped fix our broken immigration system while also spurring economic growth in northeastern Pennsylvania, where my district is, and also across the country. In fact, according to a White House report, the bipartisan Senate immigration bill would have spurred Pennsylvania's economy and created approximately 15,780 new jobs and generated $64 million for Pennsylvania. That was a bill that was supported by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the American Farm Bureau. Following the House Republican leadership's failure to act on that bipartisan Senate immigration bill, the administration took executive action, as you all know, late last year. The anticipated economic benefits are significant. For example, the White House Council on Economic Advisors has conservatively estimated that the executive actions on immigration would raise the level of GDP by 0.5% after 10 years, which is equivalent to an additional $100 billion in real GDP in 2024 in today's dollars. Would cut federal deficits by $30 billion in 10 years. It would expand the country's labor force by 200,000 people and raise average wages for U.S.-born workers. Without immigration reform, our current immigration laws impose huge fiscal and economic costs. A recent report from the American Action Forum, a conservative-leaning policy institute headed by Douglas Holtz-Eakin, concluded the 20-year cost of apprehending and removing all undocumented immigrants while securing the borders would cost taxpayers between $815 billion and $1.2 trillion. That's trillion with a T. They also found, and I quote, the labor force would shrink by 6.4% or 11 million workers, and as a result, in 20 years, the U.S. GDP would be 5.7% or $1.6 trillion lower than it would be without fully enforcing current law. This conservative-leaning group's analysis is useful, and it's a reminder that all immigration reform policies have a price tag attached to them. It's up to us in Congress appropriately to weigh those costs and other factors when we are crafting laws. And I think why you've seen so many Republicans and Democrats, not to mention scores of labor, business, and advocacy groups, come down on the side of supporting a comprehensive approach to immigration reform. It strikes the right balance. It secures our borders, it strengthens our economy, it brings millions of undocumented immigrants out of the shadows and into tax-paying individuals, paying their fair share into our health care and Social Security systems, which everyone knows could use shoring up all the time. A comprehensive solution is what we need. It's something that will advance our country's values and will honor our history as a nation of immigrants. Again, I thank the chair, and I look forward to our witnesses' testimony today. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the Benefits Subcommittee, Mr. Jordan, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman and for this hearing and our esteemed witnesses who are here today. I'll be real brief. The title of the hearing is the fiscal cost of the president's executive actions on immigration. I like to view it as the unfairness of the president's executive actions. In this hearing room, as the chairman pointed out in his opening statement, a colleague to my left here, Mr. Mulvaney, asked IRS Commissioner, can illegal non-citizens get tax refunds? Can they go back the previous 3 years and get those? Yes, they can. How is that fair to taxpayers? How is that fair to citizens? How is it fair that to seniors that illegal non-citizens can also participate in our Social Security system? Most importantly, how is it fair to legal immigrants who did everything the right way, that now through the president's executive order, illegal non-citizens move to the front of the line, take resources away from people who were doing it the right way and did it the right way when they came here? And then also in this very hearing room, 4 weeks ago, we had two Secretaries of State who came and said, because of the president's action, because of the documents illegal non-citizens are now going to have access to, namely Social Security cards, Social Security numbers, and a driver's license, the potential, the real potential for 5 million people participating in our election process around the country has increased dramatically. So much so that our Secretary of State sent a letter to the White House, a letter to the Ohio delegation, and came here and testified. So for all those reasons, cost and unfairness, those are huge concerns, and that's why this hearing is appropriate and why I'm glad the chairman has convened it and look forward to hearing from our witnesses. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Thank you. I will hold the record open for 5 legislative days for any member who would like to submit a written statement. We will now recognize our witnesses. Pleased to welcome Mr. Robert Rector, Senior Research Fellow for Domestic Policy Studies at the DeVos Center for Religion and Civil Society at the Heritage Foundation. Dr. Stephen Camerata, PhD, Director of Research at the Center for Immigration Studies. Ms. Eileen O'Connor, Esquire, Partner at Pillsbury, Winthrop, Shaw and Pittman. And Ms. Avide Mousavian, did I say that right? Economic Justice Policy Attorney at the National Immigration Law Center. Welcome all pursuant to committee rules. All witnesses will be sworn in before they testify. If you please rise and raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. In order to allow time for questions, please limit your testimony to 5 minutes. Your entire written statement will be made a part of the record. Mr. Rector, you're up for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to speak today. I'm going to talk about the fiscal costs of one part of the amnesty, the deferred action for parents. Our estimate is that there are about 3.9 million illegal immigrants who are eligible to gain legal status through this program. On average, these individuals have a 10th grade education. And I want to emphasize that. Many of them have a 3rd and 4th grade education. And I'm kind of a strange person. For the last decade or so, I've gone around and asked people in the U.S., how many people believe that someone with a 10th grade education pays more in taxes than they get in government benefits? And outside the confines of Congress, I have yet to find a single American citizen that believes that is the case. And the reality is that when you look either at legal immigrants or U.S.-born people, individuals who do not have a high school degree, in general, if you look at all the government benefits, federal, state, and local, that they get, and all the taxes they pay, income tax, property tax, cigarette tax, lottery payments, all of those things, on average, that individual who does not have a high school degree gets $5 in government benefits for every $1 they pay in taxes. Now, the illegal immigrant population in the United States gets about $2.50 in total benefits, federal, state, and local, minus taxes for every dollar paid, 250 to 1. And the reason for that is that the illegal immigrants do not have access to our 2 most expensive programs, Social Security and Medicare, and their access to the 80 different means-tested anti-poverty programs such as Medicaid and food stamps is limited. What Obama's executive action does is it essentially removes those barriers. The first thing that it does is it grants 3.9 million people with a 10th grade education, a Social Security number, which makes them eligible for Social Security and Medicare at retirement age. They have to work 40 quarters or 10 years, but it's a minimal work requirement. So most of those individuals, to the extent that they apply and receive that amnesty, will in fact become eligible for Social Security and Medicare. And the question would be, how much does that cost? Well, if you assume that they, in today's dollars, get the average Social Security and Medicare benefits that go to legal immigrants who are elderly with that same level of education, the cost is they're going to be getting over $20,000 a year in benefits in retirement in today's dollars. It'll actually be much more than that, obviously. And the total cost of that is $1.3 trillion. This is a system that is already completely bankrupt, and what the president has done is taken nearly 4 million people with a 10th grade education and given them benefits into that program. Now, it is true that they will pay a small amount in FICA taxes, but in general, they're going to be getting $3 of benefits in there for every dollar FICA taxes that pay. And I'm going to show that they actually really don't ever make a net payment. They say, well, we need them to pay taxes. This group never makes a net payment into the U.S. Treasury. At every stage of their lives, they will always be drawing more out in government benefits than they pay in. How can that be? Well, for example, this household already, because they have U.S.-born citizens, gets around $6,500 a year in means-tested benefits for their kids, food stamps, Medicaid, S-chip, so forth. The this action gives them access to the ACTC and EITC, which are the largest cash welfare programs. That's another $4,000 per household per year. Now, on top of that, the action doesn't give them access to Obamacare, but I would ask anybody who supports this, do you think we ought to let them stay here for 30 years and never give them health care? Not very feasible. If they got Obamacare, that's around another $7,500 a year. That's close to $18,000 a year in benefits that they'll be getting even before they get into retirement. It vastly exceeds the FICA and income taxes that they pay. So it's an illusion. The way this is ordinarily done is you talk about, well, they may make $5,000 or $6,000 in Social Security or FICA taxes, and they put that money in. But that doesn't do the U.S. Treasury any good if at the same time they put $5,000 or $6,000 into the Social Security Trust Fund, they draw $20,000 out of general revenue. Is the U.S. Treasury any better for that? Absolutely not. And the reality is that this group on the federal level never makes a net contribution. The FICA taxes they pay are more than offset by what they draw back. At the state and local level, they're getting around $18,000, $19,000 in free public education. They never cover that cost. Other taxpayers have to pay for it. And then when they hit Social Security, then you have this huge loss in retirement of around $1.3 trillion. Again, the bottom line is you can't take people with a 10th grade education, bring them to the United States, give them access to the largest and most expensive entitlement system, the largest and most expensive welfare system on the globe, and expect that there will not be negative fiscal consequences. The fiscal consequences are extremely large and run in the trillions of dollars.
Thank you. Gentleman's time's expired. The chair now recognizes Dr. Camerata for 5 minutes.
Well, I would like to thank both the committee and the subcommittee for inviting me here to talk about this very important topic. Let me start by stating that there is this general agreement that individuals, immigrant or native, legal or illegal, with modest levels of education and resulting lower incomes are a net fiscal drain, paying less in taxes than they use in services. In contrast, more educated individuals, immigrant or native, earn higher wages and are a net fiscal benefit. This is not just common sense, but it's not even very controversial. Now, prior research by the Center for Immigration Studies as well as the Pew Hispanic Center indicate that about half of all illegal immigrants have not graduated high school and about another quarter have only a high school education. Now, that gives us an idea. It helps us understand what would the likely educational profile of those who receive the President's deferred action would be. Given the education level of illegal immigrants who are likely to receive DAPA, it seems certain that allowing them to remain in the country is costly to taxpayers, whether they have legal status or not. For example, in 2014, 61% of households headed by immigrants who had not graduated high school told the Census Bureau in the current population survey that they were using one of the federal welfare programs, cash and non-cash. These figures are just what they told the Census Bureau. There's actually underreporting. The actual rates are higher. Now, given the education level of immigrants likely to get DAPA, the total fiscal costs, all taxes paid minus all services used at all levels of government, is probably something like $30 billion negative, if you take into account all their taxes. Now, and their use of services. Now, what would happen if we legalize them? If everyone who is eligible for DAPA comes forward and everyone pays all the taxes they should, these are big assumptions, but if you just reduce it down, if you say, well, cut these by 10, 20%, whatever you think the compliance will be. But the point is, if everyone gets what they're entitled and pays all the taxes they're supposed to, then it looks like they would pay about $8 billion more in taxes, and you get about $9 billion more at the federal level from just the earned income tax credit and the additional child tax credit. That is the two main programs for low-income workers of this kind. In short, amnesty would increase both tax revenue and cost. But this is a reminder that you can't generate net income for public coffers from less educated, low-income people. Now, having said that, it must be remembered that most immigrants come to America to work. Most immigrants, in fact, do work. And even most illegal immigrants pay taxes. But less educated immigrants as a group do not pay anywhere near enough in taxes to cover their consumption of public services, regardless of legal status. But let me also say that the net fiscal drain that less educated immigrants create, and less educated natives for that matter, we should not see this as some kind of moral failing on their part. Instead, we should see this fiscal drain as simply reflecting the nature of the modern American economy that offers limited opportunities to the less educated, and the existence of a well-developed welfare state which provides assistance to low-income workers. And this last point is important. Welfare and work in America go together like love and marriage. The vast majority of households reporting that they're using the welfare system, particularly the non-cash programs, have a worker in them. And that describes a lot of immigrant households, particularly the ones that would get DAPA. Now, the existence of a welfare state, remember, is one of the very reasons we have an immigration system in the first place that admits some people, but not others, because we're trying to very much avoid the fiscal costs. Granting amnesty like DAPA to those in the country illegally and letting them stay negates one of the very reasons that we have a legal immigration system that selects people. Now, of course, the fiscal costs, let me say in conclusion, are only one consideration. There are many others to think about. But if we do move forward with some kind of amnesty, if the judge lifts his order, what have you, and people continue to advocate it, we have to be honest with the American people and acknowledge the very real costs that come from allowing illegal immigrants to stay in the country and not try to bamboozle them with the idea that this is going to be a fiscal benefit. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes Ms. O'Connor for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, members of the subcommittees, thank you very much for inviting me to be with you today. I speak on my own behalf as a private citizen and not on behalf of my firm or my partners or its clients. I hope to bring to you some of the understanding I've gained through many decades of working with the internal revenue laws, both inside and outside of government. You've called this hearing to examine the fiscal costs of the President's executive actions on immigration. I'll address the likely consequences of those programs to federal tax administration and enforcement. The Internal Revenue Service is charged with administering and enforcing the internal revenue laws. When enforcing the tax laws requires the involvement of a court other than the tax court, the United States interests are represented by the men and women of the United States Justice Department Tax Division. It was my privilege for 6 years to be the head of the tax division, and that is the basis of some of my experience that I will relate to you today. As required by the Inspector General Act, the Department of Treasury has an Office of the Inspector General. It was established in 1989, and in accordance with the Internal Revenue Service Reform and Restructuring Act of 1998, a new Inspector General was established, the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, often called TIGTA. The Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, or TIGTA, has studied the issue of refundable credits for many years now and issued many reports. In my testimony, I summarize many of those reports for you. To understand the phenomena that we're talking about, the impact of DACA and DAPA on tax administration and enforcement, we need to understand two phenomena: ITINs, individual tax identification numbers, and refundable credits. In 1996, the Internal Revenue Service established individual tax identification numbers so that it could track the tax payments and tax returns of people who don't have Social Security numbers because they're not Americans. Many people outside the United States, for example, might have rental property in the United States. If you do, you're taxed on that income, but you don't have a Social Security number because you're not a United States citizen. You nonetheless have to pay tax. So to track those taxes and the tax returns, the IRS established the individual tax identification number. It also almost immediately began giving those numbers to people who are in the country illegally, working, earning income, but not able to get a Social Security number because they were in the country illegally and not authorized to work. But they were working and they were earning income, so they were obligated by law to file a tax return. The Internal Revenue Service does not consider it its obligation to determine the legal immigration status of people who file tax returns. So the IRS was happy to have the tax returns that are filed by people in the country illegally and to have their tax payments. For 1997, one of the first years the IRS issued ITINs, 180,000 tax returns were filed using them. By the end of 2003, that number had blossomed to 7 million. Let me discuss for a moment refundable credits. Refundable credits are neither refunds nor credits. A refund is an amount you get back after you have paid it. A credit is an amount that is credited to your account because you have paid it. A refundable credit is neither. A refundable credit eliminates the Social Security taxes that people have paid. Low-income people are relieved of many income tax burdens because the first X amount of dollars are not taxable, and then after that they're taxed at a very low rate. The Social Security system, though, doesn't work that way, and Social Security taxes have to be paid. The Earned Income Tax Credit is a way to refund to people who have paid the Social Security tax, refund that tax to them. The Additional Child Tax Credit is another refundable credit. Again, this is an amount which represents an amount that the Treasury Department is going to write checks for, even though the person to whom they're writing the check has not actually paid any tax at all. So you can have a tax liability before one of these credits of $400, have paid in nothing, have a refundable credit of $1,000, and Uncle Sam will write you a check for $600. The same is, this is equally true of earned income tax credits and the Additional Child Tax Credit. For years and years, the Treasury Department's Inspector General for Tax Administration has been warning the Internal Revenue Service that these refundable credit systems are absolutely fraught with fraud. Hundreds of billions of dollars are paid out annually on fraudulent refund claims. The Treasury Inspector General also pointed out to Senator Roth back in the 1990s that the Earned Income Tax Credit was being given to people who were not eligible to be working in the United States. Congress then changed the law to make a Social Security number a requirement for the Earned Income Tax Credit. That same requirement, though, was not extended to the Additional Child Tax Credit. So contrary to what my colleague on the right here said a few moments ago, Additional Child Tax Credits, the refundable credit, are paid out to people who don't have Social Security numbers, who are in the country and working in the country illegally.
And we'll have your written testimony. I see your time's expired, so thank you for that. And Chairman, I'll recognize Ms. Musuvian for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman DeSantis and Jordan, Ranking Members Lynch and Cartwright, and members of the subcommittees. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the subcommittees today. My name is Abida Musavian, and I'm an economic justice policy attorney at the National Immigration Law Center, an organization dedicated to ensuring that all Americans, regardless of how much money they have or where they were born, have the tools they need to achieve their full human potential. I'm also the daughter of Iranian immigrants who are proud to have raised 4 American children and to call this country their home. Last November, President Obama announced policy changes that will allow parents of Americans and people who came here in their childhood to apply for temporary relief from deportation and work authorization. The application process, which includes a $465 fee and an extensive criminal background check, would allow immigrants with deep ties to this country to contribute more fully to our economy and to our communities. These initiatives are an important first step towards fixing parts of our broken immigration system, and the economic benefits of these initiatives are profound. Deferred Action for Parents of Americans, or DAPA, and Expanded Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, will provide a natural economic stimulus for everyone. Both the Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee on Taxation estimate that DAPA and expanded DACA recipients would generate $18.9 billion in revenues in the next 10 years. Conversely, they estimated that not implementing these policies would severely harm the federal budget and increase the federal deficit by over $6.3 billion in that same 10-year period. Beyond payroll and income taxes, the Council of Economic Advisors estimates that the November 2014 deferred action initiatives will collectively increase our nation's gross domestic product in the next 10 years by $90 to $210 billion. Although immigrants who qualify for DAPA and expanded DACA pay taxes, they're nevertheless excluded from many economic supports. They're unable to purchase health insurance, even at full cost, in state or federally run health exchanges, as acknowledged by my co-panelist. They're also excluded from programs such as temporary assistance for needy families, SNAP, and federal Medicaid, among others. As taxpayers, however, those with the Social Security number are subject to the same rights and responsibilities as every other taxpayer, and for good reason. Our tax structure should encourage and facilitate all workers, regardless of their immigration status, to submit their taxes in a timely fashion. It's a long-standing federal tax principle that the same rules apply to all taxpayers who are working lawfully in the United States, and this includes access to certain earned economic supports like the Earned Income Tax Credit. And while we may disagree on the President's executive actions, we need to protect the integrity of our tax system. The impact that DAPA and expanded DACA will have on all of our communities extends beyond dollars and cents, though. Once DAPA and expanded DACA begin to take effect, millions of aspiring Americans redouble their investment in this country. These actions will make our communities safer, more prosperous, and better integrated in ways that simply cannot be calculated. Once implemented, these immigration initiatives will have a life-changing impact on the parents and young immigrants eligible to apply. A good example is Maria from Orange County, California. Maria is the proud mother of 5 children, including a son and a daughter who are U.S. citizens and one child who's a recipient of DACA and attending college today. She came to the United States 19 years ago to escape domestic violence and poverty in Mexico, and she supports her family as a waitress. DAPA would allow Maria and her family members who are undocumented to apply for deferred action and work permits. It would also allow them to be paid fair wages and contribute as taxpayers while striving for greater educational opportunities and job opportunities to reach their full potential. Maria and her family, including a nephew who's a U.S. military veteran, are proud Americans. They're just one example of why the deferred action initiatives are an important opportunity for our nation to make a smart, long-term investment in our shared economic prosperity. I thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Mr. Rector, is it your understanding that an illegal immigrant who's amnestied by the President's executive actions will be able to file retroactive tax returns for 3 years?
That is correct.
And so they would be able to claim the Earned Income Tax Credit, the additional child tax credit for work that they performed that was illegal when they performed it?
Yes, although they don't even really have to do that, because in order to get those 2 credits, all they have to do is assert that they performed the work. The IRS does not actually check that. And if you look at the IRS's own documents, they show that 25% of all EITC payments, close to $20 billion a year, are fraudulent on the basis of people claiming that they did certain work that they probably never performed at all. So all they would have to do is assert that they performed certain amounts of work, and they would be able to get the refundable EITC and ACTC. I calculate that if they did it without a lot of fraud, it would still cost around $20 billion retroactively.
And Ms. O'Connor, apart from the executive actions on illegal immigration, the IRS, they do pay out a substantial amount in fraudulent refundable credits just generally, correct?
Right. The program is fraught with.
Can you hit your microphone?
Thank you. The program is fraught with fraud, right?
Of all the programs, I mean, I think this has got to be one of the highest fraud rates across the entire federal government. In 2011, TIGDA recommended that the IRS require additional documentation to support claims of child tax credits in particular. Did the IRS implement that recommendation?
No, the IRS says that it is not authorized to ask for documentation during the return processing period, that it is only if they select a return for examination that they can ask for documentation justifying the credit.
So has the IRS taken any steps to reduce the amount of fraud in refundable tax credits?
Well, as I mentioned in my testimony, every year the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration gives the Internal Revenue Service a number of recommendations, and the IRS does follow many of them, but the rate of fraud continues to increase. It went up 23%, as a matter of fact, according to a GAO report issued just yesterday, went up 23% from 2013 to 2014.
Do you know how much refundable credit fraud can be traced to individuals who are not authorized to work but nevertheless are working in the United States?
I do not.
Do you, Dr. Camerata?
Yes, in 2011, the Inspector General said $4.3 billion for the ACTC went out to people who were not authorized to work in the United States. And they know that from auditing the records, and this is the people who were getting that money without Social Security numbers but did use an ITIN. So that's how they know it.
So what would be the easiest way for Congress to address if we said, look, these refundable tax credits, they're on the books, but we want them to go to people who are working legally? What would we need to do to make it, to reduce the fraud?
Well, require documentation for both the income and require valid Social Security numbers for them would be like just a common sense step and not keep paying them out.
And require the Internal Revenue Service to verify the eligibility for the credit before they pay them out. That's the problem. They pay them out first without checking.
If I may add, the TIGTA report that my colleague on the panel quoted was from 2011. Since then, the IRS has implemented very rigid changes to the Individual Taxpayer Identification Number program, the ITIN program, and it's resulted in a drastic reduction in the number of ITINs that are issued. So in fact, those figures don't reflect the IRS's initiative to address alleged allegations of fraud within the child tax credit program.
Is that, what's the basis of that? Is that your understanding of that they've reduced the fraud by a lot?
No, not at all. Remember that it's not fraud for someone in the country illegally to get the additional child tax credit. Congress has never made it clear, notwithstanding IRS's published position that you don't have to have a Social Security number to get the additional child tax credit. Congress should make that clear if that's its intention. Further, the GAO report issued yesterday says that IRS issued $17.7 billion in improper payments of the earned income tax credit just last year. That's a 23% increase over the year before.
Yeah, no, that's a staggering amount of fraud. This could be for Dr. Camerata or Mr. Rector. Does the President's November 2014 executive actions include a requirement that any candidate for, quote, deferred action have never filed for nor received nor been party to tax or other federal benefits for which he or she was not entitled at the time?
No, it doesn't require that. I would say on behalf of the Earned Income Tax Credit, we know that there's a lot of fraud in that program because it's very rigorously audited. If you were to go over to, say, the food stamp program, there's a fraud rate of at least 10% over there that you never hear about because they don't audit it as well. And if you want to see real fraud, go to public housing. So there's a massive amount of cases where individuals claim or hide income. In the case of the EITC, claiming income that they don't actually have in order to gain the benefit. In the case of these other programs, working off the books and hiding the income in order to get benefits. It's rife within the entire welfare system, not just the EITC.
Thank you. My time's expired. The chair will now recognize Mr. Lynch for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Cartwright has a scheduling problem, so I would like to yield my time to him, and then I'll take his time later.
Very well.
Thank you, Mr. Lynch. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. From Mr. Rector's testimony today, we have heard many absolutely stunning numbers on the fiscal costs of the administration's deferred action programs. For example, Mr. Rector's written testimony states, quote, increased EITC and ACTC cash payments to DAPA recipients would be $7.8 billion per year, unquote. Now, this figure is more than 10 times the estimate by the nonpartisan, not Democrat, not Republican, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office earlier this year. With all due respect, This is not the first time immigration cost analyses from the Heritage Foundation have come under scrutiny. For example, a May 2013 immigration report by Mr. Rector was sharply criticized by the Cato Institute. And they said of that study, and I quote, "Its flawed methodology and lack of relevancy to the current immigration reform proposal relegate this study to irrelevancy," unquote. Now, Mr. Rector, my question is, were you aware of this criticism by the Cato Institute at that time?
Yes, I am aware of the criticism by the...
And why did you choose to ignore any potential economic benefit that would come from introducing these people into our workforce?
Would you like me to answer that?
Sure.
Okay. The EITC numbers that I have come directly out of the census, okay? The census, when we talk about illegal immigrants, most of them are inside the census. Now, the census takes the family's income and their demography, and it imputes a value for the Earned Income Tax Credit. So the number that I gave there, roughly $7 billion, is simply takes the illegal immigrant population that's subject to DAPA and takes the census number and adds it together. Okay?
A study relegated to irrelevancy by the Cato Institute and more than 10 times the estimate by the nonpartisan CBO. We need to talk about this later, but I only have 5 minutes, and I want to shift over to Ms. O'Connor, Mr. Rector. Ms. O'Connor, my impression from your written testimony was that in large part it is a restatement of TIGTA reports. Would that be a fair statement? All right. And TIGTA, of course, is the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, right? And what you've done is that you have you've taken the points out of a number of TIGTA reports on this whole question, right?
Right.
So now, since November of 2004, the man's name has been J. Russell George. Am I correct in that?
You are correct.
That's the TIGTA that we're talking about, right? Mm-hmm. So if I invite your attention to page 4 of your written testimony, the first report there is a 2009 Inspector General. And when you say Inspector General, you're talking about TIGTA in your report, right?
That's right.
My question is, why didn't you mention J. Russell George's name when you talked about that 2009 TIGTA report? It's not in there, is it?
I did not mention him by name because what's important is the office.
Right, let me move on to the next one.
The first TIGTA report I mentioned was before Mr. George took office.
You mentioned another 2009 report from TIGTA on the same page. You didn't mention J. Russell George's name there either, did you?
Why would I?
And then on page 5, well, you mentioned the Inspector General on a report from 2011, a third report from TIGTA. You don't mention J. Russell George's name in that one either. Am I correct in that?
What you're missing is that I'm referring to reports that are prepared by the Office of the Treasury Inspector General.
And then on page 6, you mentioned a fourth report from TIGTA, and you also mentioned a 2013 report from the Inspector General.
But was not
Ms. O'Connor, I'm asking you simple yes or no questions, and I'm entitled to a response. And the fourth report on page 6 refers to a 2013 IG report. It's also from TIGTA. You don't mention Mr. Russell George's name in that report.
And I didn't mention the name of the TIGTA in the first TIGTA report I mentioned.
You didn't mention
and
on page 6, number 5 report, last year, 2014, Inspector General mentioned another set of findings. You didn't mention J. Russell George's name in that 5th report either, did you?
And your point is?
Are you aware, Ms. O'Connor, that Representative Jerry Connolly from Virginia and I have called for an ethics complaint against J. Russell George for his handling of other matters because of his lack of nonpartisanship? Are you aware of that, Ms. O'Connor?
Nope.
I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the Benefits Subcommittee, Mr. Jordan, for 5 minutes.
I apologize, Mr. Chairman. Let me just go with a couple of numbers here. Well, first of all, Mr. Rector, would you characterize Cato as nonpartisan when it comes to the immigration issue?
The Cato Institute is an open borders libertarian institution.
Yeah, okay. That's what I thought.
It believes in no restrictions on immigration whatsoever, and everything that they have to say on this policy flows from that rather
Slightly different position than Heritage takes,
A
right?
little bit.
I mean, I like the Cato Institute. I think they do some great work, but on this particular issue, I'm not where they're at. So to cite them as the end-all, be-all definitive statement on numbers that Heritage has on immigration policy, I don't think makes sense. Ms. O'Connor, you mentioned 7 million people with the tax identification number. You mentioned 7 million in your testimony. Tell me what that number is again. These are, because there was a dramatic increase from when the tax ID number was first put in place, I believe you said in the mid-90s, to where it is today. Right. Can you elaborate on that, please? That
7 million number is a couple of years old already. The Internal Revenue Service says it issues about 2.5 million additional I-10s every year.
So that number, that 7 million was from what year?
I think that was 2009.
So it's significantly higher today.
Right.
And the 5 million who are just part of the president's latest, would they be reflected in the most current number, whatever that number is, or is that going to be 5 million additional added to that number?
That's a good question. Since we know that many people who are in the country illegally are already paying taxes,
right,
and that they use ITINs to do so, I wouldn't imagine that the president's action is going to increase the number of ITINs
dramatically, but it increases
that much more than it increases every year anyway.
Okay. Okay. Mr. Camerata, you mentioned I'm just jotting down notes here. You mentioned $4.3 billion number from a 2011 study. Tell me about that again.
Right. Well, the Inspector General went through and looked at all the people in the United States who were working and filed an income tax return using an ITIN, and then they gave them $4.3 billion. The Inspector General report is very clear that basically all these individuals are illegal immigrants getting the ACTC, the cash portion of the additional child tax credit. That is, they didn't pay any federal income tax, and they gave them $4.3 billion instead.
Okay. And so I'm not sure if the chairman asked this question in his time, but based on what the president did in November, the additional $5 billion, and this sort of relates to the previous question I just asked Ms. O'Connor. What do you anticipate that number? Is it going to go up significantly? What's going to happen?
We would certainly expect that now that they have valid socials, more of them would actually work on the books. We think right now only about 55% of illegal immigrants work on the books, but presumably that number would increase with legalization and valid Social Security numbers. So the number of people getting the EITC or the ACTC, which we've been discussing here, would grow proportionally, depending on how many people come forward. But obviously, if it's a lot of folks, it'll run into the billions.
Well, I got you, Mr. Doctor. The numbers you cited the Inspector General. Mr. Cartwright made a big deal of the Inspector General in his previous time. In your estimation, the reports and the numbers you've received from the Inspector General, are they in any way not accurate? Is there some doubt as to the validity of the reports and numbers that the Inspector General has brought forward?
No, these are pretty straightforward. How many people are filing income tax returns with? So
it doesn't matter if the Inspector General is Russell George or Santa Claus, right? As long as the numbers add up, it adds up, right?
I have no reason to doubt them.
Now, the Democrats like to make a big deal out of Mr. George, but the fact is, when Mr. George discovered the targeting was taking place, he gave a heads up to the Treasury Department. He gave a heads up to the IRS. This is clear back when it was before the presidential election. He gave a heads up to everyone else. He didn't give us a heads up. I'd have liked for him to told Congress that the IRS was using the terms Tea Party and Patriot to identify groups and put them in this category where they never got their tax-exempt status. They like to make a big deal about they filed some ethics charge against him, but the truth is, Mr. George, if anyone has a complaint with Mr. George, it should be Republicans, because he told the White House and the administration information before he ever told us. In fact, 6 months before. So this whole idea that somehow these numbers are not valid, not accurate, makes no sense to me, and we can make a big deal out if we want, but the fact is they targeted conservative groups. Now they're just giving us accurate numbers. This is simple mathematics, right? Yeah, simple math.
My knowledge.
Simple math, and you guys are bringing that information forward, and for that, we thank you, and I yield.
Congressmember, if I may add, the same TIGTA report.
The gentleman's time's expired. The chair asked unanimous consent to enter into the record. This is the GAO report published this Monday, March 16th, about improper payments for the whole government, but it does include the information on the earned income tax credit. Without objection, so ordered. The chair now recognizes proud Bostonian on St. Patrick's Day, Mr. Lynch, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and that's part of the reason why I arrived a little bit late. We have the Taoiseach of Ireland in today, and maybe it's an Irish trait, but he spoke a little bit long, so I had to. So I arrived a little bit late. I want to thank all the witnesses. You've all been helpful. While you're not in agreement, I would hope that our immigration policy would be data-driven to some extent, and the ideas that you've shared are certainly very helpful. I think the answer to this is to structure an immigration policy and immigration laws that maximize the longer-term general benefits to our economy and to our country, while at the same time trying to mitigate and eliminate possibly some of the short-term costs that you're describing, which are more local in many respects. The president, with all due respects, hasn't had that opportunity. DAPA is a very blunt instrument. It doesn't allow us to, as I said before, maximize the positive and mitigate the negative. It's a rather crude instrument. It's not of his choosing. I think the president has said on many occasions that he would prefer to have a comprehensive, well thought out, well structured, thoroughly debated, data-driven immigration law introduced rather than using this more crude mechanism, but this is what he's left with. That's what the president has said on countless occasions. And there are some longer-term general benefits. I know that one of my issues is Social Security, and the birth rate in the United States is not sufficient. We don't have a sufficient, what they call a replacement rate, because new workers aren't coming into the economy. The birth rate is so low, and that fewer number of citizens will eventually carry a tremendous burden for the pensions and Social Security obligations and tax burden for a much larger, earlier generation. And so immigration could help that if it were structured in a positive way. We could address that gap. But Mr. Musavian, you've been very, very kind to appear before us, and I want to ask you about the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Work Pays initiative. At the time of the program's expansion, Senator Chuck Grassley took to the Senate floor to support the Earned Income Tax Credit, stating, and this is a quote from him, "It's important to bear in mind that billions of dollars that have been provided in this bill to encourage struggling families to enter the workforce or expand the number of hours they work. Too often we focus on the welfare-specific provisions and completely forget or ignore the major efforts to encourage work that are contained in the tax code." Mr. Musavian, I'd like to work. Is that your understanding of that provision? Is that how it works?
The Earned Income Tax Credit is a long-standing tax program that's meant to incentivize work and recognize that work should be acknowledged, particularly for low-income families that are struggling to support their children and their families.
In general, would you agree that families who receive the EITC increase the number of hours that they work? Is that how this works?
The Earned Income Tax Credit is only for people who are working and who are paying taxes. So in that sense, it was intended specifically as an alternative to public safety net programs and means-tested public benefits. So it's entirely different in nature. It rewards work. It rewards particularly work performed by low-income families. Over 74% of recipients of the Earned Income Tax Credit make less than $25,000 a year. So in that sense, these are vital economic supports that are viewed as essentially an economic stimulus for the local communities that money gets reinjected back into.
So for that strata, I guess, that classification of low income and middle income families, you believe that the EITC original purpose is served by continuing to encourage them to work?
That's correct.
Okay. Regarding the child tax credit, Senator Grassley also stated, and that's another quote, this is a tax credit that particularly helps low and middle income families who pay for child care for their young children. Ms. Mousavian, do you agree with Senator Grassley that the tax credit does help with that when affording child care for their young children is considered?
Yes, both the EITC and the CTC by design are anti-poverty programs, and they have been enormously effective in lifting millions of low-income families, working, tax-paying low-income families out of poverty. So they provide essential economic supports for families so that they don't have to make difficult choices about, do I put food on the table for my young child, do I pay the utility bill, or do I pay the rent? It allows those families to invest, and again, these are parents of largely U.S. citizen children, so by proposing any threats to change access to these important anti-poverty programs, we're hurting U.S. citizen kids. And I would just add, I apologize if I had interrupted my co-panelist before, but I wanted to also correct, these are taxpayers, and the ITIN program that's available to non-citizen, both unauthorized immigrants as well as those with status who are lawfully, those who are lawfully present, they make tax contributions. In fact, the same TIGTA Inspector General that we've been citing reports to, his 2011 report specifically said that in the tax year 2010, ITIN holders contributed $897 million in tax revenue. So yes, there are some ITIN holders or some immigrants who are receiving this tax credit, but again, to your point, it goes to provide those families with really vital economic supports.
Thank you, Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence. I realize I went over, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Mulvaney, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Happy St. Patrick's Day to everybody. Thank you, Mrs. O'Connor, for Mr. Mulvaney, for wearing your green today. I'm sitting here talking to my friend, Mr. Jordan, trying to figure out what to talk about. Mr. Rector, every time I listen to you, and I have before, you and I have talked about this before, the thing that just sticks in my craw is that every time I listen to you, I get the feeling that you think all immigration is bad. And I know that's not the message you want to convey, but that's the message you convey, is that immigrants are bad. And I have to disagree with that fundamentally. At the same time, Ms. Mousavian, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, I look at what the president did, and I think that doesn't work either. Okay? What Mr. Rector wants to do, which is keep everybody out, doesn't work. And what you're defending, what the president did, which was at the stroke of a pen violate the law and give bunches of benefits to people costing billions of dollars, is also wrong. So instead of sitting here and trying to figure out who's right, because I think neither of you are right, help me be more positive today on St. Patrick's Day. Tell me what a functioning and healthy legal immigration system looks like. Mr. Rector, I'll start with you. You can keep your answer fairly short because I want to hear from everybody on this. I don't want to eat up all my time. So.
Been very clear over the last decade or so that when you look at the fiscal consequences of immigration, immigrants who have a college degree pay far more in taxes than they take out.
I hear you, Mr. Rector, and listen, again, I'm not going to go into the details of it, but that's, and I recognize the fact the welfare system and welfare state is different now than it was when my great-grandparents came over. But we didn't build the country on college graduates. That's just not how it worked. When my great-grandparents came over, they were farmers who came because they were literally starving to death. They were not college graduates. They were not doctors and lawyers. They came over, and that's how we built the country. So I hear what you're saying, and I don't want to get into it today. Give me one idea on how we provide for a healthy, legal immigration system going forward.
Bring in people who are net taxpayers and will not impose additional cost on the already extraordinarily overburdened U.S. taxpayer.
Now, we could do it differently, though, right, Mr. Rector? We could do it differently than that. Again, when my ancestors came over, didn't have much of a welfare state at the time. We had a little bit. And they were required, I believe, if I know my history right, they were required to have a sponsor who have effectively posted a bond for them and said, Mrs. O'Connor is coming over. She's my responsibility. She's my ward, and I'm guaranteeing that she will not be on any federal programs for the next 15 or 20 years. That's the history, right? Give or take. Ms. O'Connor, am I right about that?
I believe so.
And we could do that again now, right? Couldn't we? And we could allow folks to come over, and they wouldn't be a net tax loss, right?
Those principles are still in effect. It's still in the law. I've been doing this for 40 years. I have yet to see a single individual who has gone and and redeemed that bond because these families go on welfare. It's just, I understand what you just said.
Okay.
It's in law. It's never, ever enforced.
So if we're looking for something we could agree on, that enforcing the current immigration law might do great steps towards improving things.
Again, you have to simply acknowledge that if you bring in people that have very low education levels, there is a fiscal cost. If you want to do that, I'm just going to tell you what the fiscal cost is.
Ms. O'Connor, you want to check in on this? Give me some ideas on how to fix the legal immigration system in the country.
Enforce it.
Okay. That's fair. So you think the laws we have now are adequate?
Well, I have not studied immigration law to a large extent. I am, however, a first-generation American, so I have some personal experience with immigration and naturalization. But the problem that I see from a tax perspective is what's being called amnesty bonuses. We have open borders and a welfare system, and that relinquishes our sovereignty, and that's wrong.
Oh, I agree. And I think that's the difficulty, Ms. Musavian, of what the president has just done. He's created a financial bonus for having come here illegally. And that's what strikes so many of us, even those of us who are for reforming the legal immigration system, as being unfair. Because we're looking at folks and saying, look, if you came here legally, you don't get the 3 years backward-looking earned income tax credit. I mean, there's an incentive to have come here illegally, and that's simply not fair.
Immediately repeal all refundable credits and take the Internal Revenue Service out of the business of welfare program administration.
Ms. Musavian, I've got about 20 seconds later. Give me an idea on how to fix legal immigration.
So first I would say that people who are eligible for DAPA and DACA are not going to be eligible for any of the federal public benefits programs that we're talking about. In fact, any of you who have met with any of our staff have seen this chart that really highlights all the barriers to access to programs.
I'm sorry, and I'm sorry to go over my time, but I'm misunderstanding you because I had Mr. Koskinen in here and I asked him myself if someone qualified for the president's amnesty from November.
The tax credit programs aren't federal public benefits. They're for people who are taxpayers and who are workers. And these are people who are paying without any type of work authorization. They're contributing $13 billion in, just to give one example, in the tax year 2010
again, you're
alone.
consolidating. I'm giving you one example. There's someone who's here. They came here illegally. They might have worked. They might not have. The president is now going to give them a Social Security number, and they can claim 3 years back to the EITC.
This look-back provision that we're talking about claiming past years, it is not exclusive to the EITC. It's not exclusive to people who would be getting Social Security numbers through DAPA or DACA.
Gentlemen's time expired.
It exists across the
Time's expired. We have, votes have been called. We definitely have time to recognize. I'm going to recognize Mr. Liu, and then I think at that point, we'll stand in recess. I do think that this is likely to be a lengthy vote series. So the witnesses, if we're in recess for an hour, how is your schedule? Would you be able to reconvene at that time? Okay, so that'll be the plan. So the chair now recognizes the gentleman from California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We've heard some numbers today from the Heritage Foundation. There's other institutions that have also done economic analysis, and I'd like to put those on the record. So last month, the Council of Economic Advisors released its latest economic analysis of the administration's executive actions. My question is going to be for Ms. Musavian. It's true, isn't it, that they estimated that these actions would raise America's GDP level by between $100 billion to $250 billion over the next 10 years?
Yes, that's correct. I believe the estimates are between 90 to 210 billion, according to the Center. According to that same study.
It would also reduce the federal deficit by $30 billion over the next 10 years.
That's correct.
So let's look at it another way, which is if we were to eliminate these actions. We also had some analysis on that. In January, the Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee on Taxation made some estimates of what would happen if we eliminated the deferred action for parental accountability and the deferred action for childhood arrivals. They said, isn't it true that that would actually increase the federal deficit by $7.5 billion over 10 years?
Yes, that's correct.
And those two institutions are nonpartisan or bipartisan, correct?
Yes.
And then it's also my understanding the Joint Committee on Taxation estimated $14.9 billion may be spent on EITC, but it'll be offset by $22.3 billion in additional Social Security payroll taxes. Isn't that correct?
Yes, it is.
All right. So I'm going to reserve the balance of my time to make a statement, and it's going to be directed to Mr. Rector, not so much on the substance of your testimony, but just on the tone of it. And I think it's easy for people like you and me who wear suits and ties and work in offices to cast aspersions on those with a 10th grade education. And I certainly hope you're not saying that only those with college degrees or high school degrees should be eligible for federal benefits. But let's talk about some of these folks with the 10th grade education, such as Maria Isabel Jimenez. She was a farm worker, 17 years old. She worked for 9 hours one day in a farm near Stockton in brutal heat without shade or water, and then she collapsed. She was taken to a hospital. Her body temperature was 108.4 degrees. She died 2 days later. When I was in the California State Legislature, I had the opportunity to meet over many years many farm workers who've had families die in brutal conditions in the heat so that you and I can have less expensive orange juice, cheaper artichokes, less expensive garlic. And I just want to suggest that people like Maria Isabel Jimenez, and you kept talking about net contributions, that her net contribution in dying so that you and I can have cheaper grocery bills so that we can spend less, she's given far more to American society than you and I ever will. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We do have some more time, so the chair will, Mr. Carter is in the queue if you'd like to go. Chair will recognize the gentleman from Georgia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here. You know, I want to bear with me, if you will, okay? Are any of you parents, just by chance? Yeah? No? Okay. Well, you know, it's just what bothers me so much here is it just seems like we're rewarding bad behavior. Would you agree with that? Absolutely. Mr. Rector? Absolutely. Microphone.
Yeah. What you have here is a situation where you're taking close to 4 million people, you're granting them access to the most expensive government entitlement system in the world, and my calculations are that over the course of a lifetime, the total benefits they'll get through amnesty, minus the taxes they pay in, is around $500,000 or $600,000. It's a massive reward. And then we talk about, oh, they'll pay a fine of $1,000. You're basically, there are millions, hundreds of millions of people that would like to come and live in the United States. And what you're doing here is not only permitting people to stay here legally, but giving them this massive financial windfall because they came here and broke our laws. I think that sends a very bad message through our population and across the globe, and I think it's completely unfair to the U.S. taxpayer.
Okay. Dr. Cameron?
I mean, look, we tried it before, right? We gave amnesty to nearly 3 million people, and we ended up with 10 to 12 million more that replaced those folks. It seems hard to imagine that rewarding illegal activity is going to give you less of it in the future.
Ms. O'Connor?
Similarly, by rewarding it, we are creating an incentive for more of it. And we're punishing the people who have been waiting in line for the legal immigration, because our systems are going to be completely overwhelmed by handling the DACA and DAPA applicants, that those people who have already been waiting in line for years are going to be waiting in line for more years to enter the country legally.
And you're not a parent, but I mean, you had parents. I'm sorry, Ms.
Musavian, yes.
Musavian.
Yes, I'm from a very large family. But my comment is that this is recognizing work, and it's work that directly fed into our Social Security coffers, into our federal tax revenue, into billions of dollars in state and local taxes.
So you would subscribe to the theory that as long as you're doing something productive, it's okay to do it illegally?
I would subscribe to the theory that the IRS's mission is to enforce the Internal Revenue Code and to recognize that they want everybody to be in compliance with their tax obligations, and that by providing this important economic support to parents of U.S. citizens, 95% of the DAPA-eligible population are parents of U.S. citizens. Those are Americans who have parents who they want to stay with their families.
And how did they become U.S. citizens?
I'm sorry?
How did they become U.S. citizens?
Their children?
Their children.
I'm saying that the population
I understand.
for DAPA.
I understand. But how did their children become U.S. citizens? Because they were born here?
That's correct.
And their parents were here illegally, and they were born here. So that makes them U.S. citizens. I get that. So that means that we should reward the parents who were here illegally?
It's not rewarding them. And 2 points, if I may. First, with respect to the tax credit, it does not take away the ability of any other person with a Social Security number to make claims for those same tax programs. With respect to the parents that we're talking about of the DAPA eligible population, we're talking about a population that's been here for a minimum of 5 years, that have been paying taxes, that have been raising our next generation of innovators and students and the workforce.
Understood. So if they've been here more than 5 years illegally, that makes it okay?
Under the executive actions, the president has said, look, we need comprehensive immigration reform, and that's what I would ask of you and your colleagues, that ultimately the long-term solution rests with you. But the president has said through these initiatives, this is a way to put some order and sense into our immigration system. And rather than put these parents of U.S. citizens at risk of deportation, these are people who are going to, we want to recognize that they've been here for a long time, they're deeply embedded in our communities and in our workforce, and they're vital contributors. So that's what the president's executive actions does.
But what message do you think that sends to the children of American taxpayers who have been here legally? What message, what message does that send to our society?
The president's sending the message, I want you to be able to stay with your parents regardless of what.
The president is sending a message that it's okay to break the law.
No, he's saying that our immigration system is dysfunctional, and Congress, please work together to come up with a long-term solution. But in the interim.
Okay, so two wrongs make a right? Is that what we're saying?
I think there have been many wrongs that have led to this current situation that we're in, where we're out of touch. Our immigration laws, it's all well and good to say we should follow the laws. The problem is the system is broken at every level.
Yeah, some reason I just don't think we're going to agree on this.
But I appreciate the dialogue.
Gentleman's time's expired.
Thank you, and thank you for being here.
Thank you.
I really appreciate the witnesses. I think that we've had enough people that have asked questions, and my sense is that we probably wouldn't have very many coming back. So I want to thank the witnesses. Look, I think at the end of the day, I think all of you guys made good points. The problem with being here is that these are debates that should be had in Congress before you have massive policy changes. And the president, by unilaterally doing something that he said 22 different times he did not have the authority to do, he really short-circuited the American people's ability to weigh in on this. And we don't know what's going to happen with the courts. We don't know what Congress will do. We don't know a lot of these things right now. But I think that we need to put some of these ideas on the table, get different views, because I think taxpayers just deserve to know what effect, if any, this is going to have on the public fisc and on their tax liabilities. But I appreciate everybody, and we will stand adjourned, and this hearing concludes.